Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode I'm going to be looking at this Bachmann EWS Class 08 shunter that Pete over at Delph Junction bought from the Great Electric Train Show for £70, only to find when he got home it was a complete non-runner despite the fact he'd been sold it as a running loco. Not only is it a non-runner, but the glazing in the cab has fallen out. The coupling hook on the rear had fallen out, but that was in the box, so that was a easy quick fix. And Pete has also supplied a driver there for me to fit when I take the cab off to repair the glazing. The other part of the glazing is rattling around inside the cab. Now, giving this loco a battery test, the loco was completely dead. There was no signs of life in this whatsoever. It wasn't even attempting to move. Yet, as I said, Pete had been sold this as a running loco for £70, which in today's climate is quite a lot of money for an engine that doesn't work. So Pete sent it over to me to have a look at. So we're going to break into this Bachmann 08 now. And to do that, you have to remove the NEM coupling pockets as they reveal a couple of hidden screws. This screw under the bonnet not only undoes the body shell, but also releases these air tanks. These were stuck on with some old lubricating oil, so I had to prise them off. And then it was cleaned up with a cotton bud and meths just to make sure that next time it doesn't get stuck. There's also a screw at the back. That screw there is quite tiny. That's the one under the bonnet. There are two screws either side of the NEM pocket at the back and near the cab. These have to be removed, as well as the one that is hidden under the NEM coupler. So I'm just trying to get the screws off the magnetic pliers there. So it did flummox me a little bit. I thought that should have come off then, but as I said, reading the instructions, I had to remove the NEM pocket to find yet another hidden screw. So there's 4 screws holding this body shell in place. It's a little bit overkill, but it does the job. And then to remove the body shell, it was a pretty tight fit, but I did manage to prise the chassis away, only to find that at the front, near those cab steps, is a pipe detail for the lighting conduit. This goes from the body shell into the chassis, so this needs to be gently pulled out using a flat-bladed screwdriver, as I'm doing here, or a pair of long-nosed pliers. Now, the wire sits in a small hole in the chassis, and once it's been removed, the body shell simply lifts off. This reveals that this model is a DCC-ready model, and I'm going to give it another test, as it could be a problem with the PCB. But even applying power directly to the motor proved to be inefficient. The motor just wasn't turning, and I was fearful at this point that the motor had actually burnt out. There was no life in this whatsoever. But upon further investigation, I found that the PCB and the capacitor had been badly burned. As you can see here, it is absolutely black and encrusted with soot, and the wires next to it have actually been melted together. I've never seen this before on a Bachmann loco, and indeed I haven't actually seen it on any sort of loco before. But when I look at that capacitor, I remove the DCC blanking plate. The capacitor, or what was a capacitor, just crumbles away in my fingers. It had completely and utterly burnt out. So the DCC interface looks like it is faulty, so I'm going to have to remove it. I cut the wires with a pair of sharp small scissors, and there you can see the wires, as I mentioned, have been burnt and melted together. So I'm just going to snip these because I'm going to have to do some electrical work on this model. I unscrewed the DCC interface and then also snipped the wires that went to that, and I'm going to hardwire this model and remove the DCC capacity, as obviously that PCB had burnt out. It's terrible really, because there's no way this model could have run at the Great Electric Train Show. That has had some serious power run through it to do that. But once that's removed, I'm overjoyed to see that the motor now works fine. So the motor isn't burnt out. It was just a case that the PCB had broken and been melted. So what I'm going to do now is, there's them 2 bits of wire that have actually melted together. What I'm going to do is I am going to solder those wires together. But first I'm going to tackle that glazing. Now, to get the cab off, the cab is a clip fit. I'm just running a small scalpel blade in the gap there, because it looked as if there was a little tiny bit of adhesive holding this cab in place. Once that had been broken, the cab simply unclips to reveal limited cab detail, but also that loose glazing's in there. The glazing was located, the old glue marks were matched up to the marks inside the cab, and then the cab glazing was re-secured with some plastic weld cement. Now you don't need much of that, it works by capillary action and will seep underneath the plastic bit, and as you can see there, has actually glued it in place quite nicely. Now the driver that Pete has supplied for this model obviously isn't going to fit in the current position, so those of a squeamish disposition, look away now. I had to perform some surgery on the driver by removing the lower parts of his legs, and then with the scalpel blade I just simply shave off a little bit there just to make sure it's completely flat so that it can sit on top of the plastic there, and then through the windows it will look like the driver is standing up, as indeed they do on most of these 08 shunters. Again, he was fixed in place with some plastic weld cement and then set aside to fully dry. While that's dry, I've stripped and tinned the wires, and I'm now just attaching the pickup wires directly to the brass tabs on the motor, where the wires from the DCC circuit board went to. These were simply touched in place with the soldering iron. So this model is now direct from the track DC only, although it is going to be an easy task if you ever want to retrofit a decoder to this model. You'll just have to hardwire it. There's no lights or sound to worry about this time. Once I've reattached both those wires, I give the chassis a test, and to my joy, the chassis is now running. So it was just a case of that burnt out PCB that was stopping this 08 from running. So as you can see there, it is a lovely smooth runner. I'm just going to add some silicone grease onto that motor worm gear there, because the drivetrain on this 08 was very dry. Then I'm going to add a small amount of oil just to dilute that grease a little bit. And I'm also going to use a cocktail stick here just to use as a bit of a ramp, because this oil thing I've got has not got a very small nozzle on it. And I wanted to oil the motor bearings, so just letting it run down that cocktail stick provides just the right amount of oil. I'm going to refit the cab now. This is, as I said before, this is a simple clip fit affair. This just clips back on and snaps back in place, and you can see the driver through the window there, which is what Pete wanted. And having a quick look inside the body shell, you can see it's not very good lighting, so what I'll do is I'll actually put a close-up picture of it. But when that PCB burnt out, it has actually burnt the inside of the body shell there. It was lucky that that never went through to the exterior or has blemished the paintwork in any way. It has been contained within the body shell. I'm not sure what's caused this, but I reckon this model has been subjected to some high voltage, which has burnt that capacitor out. Now, to put the body shell back on, you have to move that lighting conduit out of the way, and I also had to tuck a couple of the wires back inside, and the screw pillars line up with the holes in the chassis, and the whole thing just simply clip fits back together. And then I can replace those 5 screws that we took out earlier. I'm just putting that conduit back into the hole in the chassis. All the screws on this model are magnetic, and these tiny little screws go through the holes that are underneath the NEM coupler pockets, and the 2 larger screws go either side underneath the cab floor. Don't forget to refit the air tanks onto the front. This little detail sits in place with 2 little nodules that fit in, and then the screw was tightened to hold it onto the chassis. Now I've turned the loco upside down. Now it's in my loco cradle because I need to get to the wheels to give them a thorough clean, and the pickups. And to do that, you have to gently remove these brake rigging pieces that Bachmann pre-fit to their models. These are a simple friction fit plastic part into holes that are cast into the chassis, so working gently with a pair of needle nose pliers, I remove these 2 detailing parts. Remove the 2 screws from the chassis keeper plate, and that allows you access to the wheels. Unfortunately, this model doesn't have any proper bearings in it. The wheels just simply sit in the die casting. And there's also this spring part here that sits on the middle axle. Now, using a cotton bud dipped in methylated spirits, I'm going to clean all around the pickups and all around the wheel welds there, just to remove any fluff and dirt. And then once all that's been removed, I did attempt to clean the wheels whilst they were out of the chassis, but because they were all linked together with the side rods, this proved to be quite a hard task because they kept going out of, not quartering, but they wouldn't turn correctly. So I'll clean them properly when they're back in the chassis. Now, to put the wheels back in the chassis, this was quite challenging because of the brass pickups. What I did was I ended up laying the wheels in their chassis bearing holes there, and then manipulating the pickups using a cocktail stick just to make sure they were seated correctly and that they were pushing on all the wheel backs. You could just put the wheels in and the pickups would have been sticking through the spokes or not making contact, so you've got to be careful if you take the wheels out of a Bachmann 08. Once everything was seated correctly, I had a small amount of oil to the axles, as like I said, there's no proper bearing, so they need some lubrication. I also put a small dollop of oil on the worm gear there, and then refit this chassis keeper plate with the 2 screws that I took out earlier on. Once the chassis keeper plate had been reattached, I get the battery and I give the wheels a thorough testing to make sure that the pickups are all seated correctly and all of them are conducting electricity. The middle wheels there weren't quite right, so they needed further adjustment. But once I was happy with the running qualities, these brake rigging parts were refitted. Now these are handed, they will only go on the side that they came off. So you just line up the pins and then gentle finger pressure will put them back into place and they will hold like that. You don't need to use any force. If you try and force them, you will end up snapping the pins or snapping the brake rigging itself. So once that's all done, and I'm just using a cocktail stick there just to manipulate the sanding pipes. This one proved a bit tricky to get in, but it went in eventually. So that's all those detail parts done. The other thing I'm going to fit onto the model is the cab footsteps. Now a tiny amount of plastic weld cement was put into the holes. These were pushed home. These were the only details that were with the 08 in the box, so I fitted them for Pete just to make sure that the 08 looked the part. And the last thing to go back on was the NEM couplers. I put the pockets in first. These slide into the grooves in the chassis. And then the NEM couplers themselves are just clip fitted in. They are quite a snug fit, but they are easy to push in with your fingers. You don't need any tools to put these NEM couplers back in. Now, as I said earlier, the wheels were quite hard to clean when they was out of the chassis, so now it's upended. I'm just giving the wheels a rotate with the battery, and I'm cleaning the wheels with a cotton bud and meths. And this front wheel here happened to have some black paint on it, which I had to scrape off using a scalpel. And once that was all removed, I just gave it a final polish up again with a cotton bud and meths. And I also cleaned the wheel backs, as obviously they need to be cleaned for the pickups to work properly. So that is Pete's 08, all serviced and back to running order. And it is baffling really that people will sell a model like that is obviously a non-runner to somebody at a show like Milton Keynes who's going to take it away only to find it's dead when they get it home. So there we go, a relatively short trash to track this time. I do like these Bachmann 08s. Now, if you're looking for an 08 shunter that's currently on the market, you can either choose from Bachmann or Hornby. Now, the Bachmann one has got a lot more torque and will haul a lot more than the Hornby one. But the Hornby one has got a bit more finesse, so you pay your money as you take your choice with that one. They are indeed both fantastic models. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. I'll have a look at getting it sent over and it may appear in an episode all of its own. I'll leave you now with the shots of the 08 just trundling around Trainsview's test layout. Not much of a running session because when I went to Trainsview and met up with Pete to hand him his locos back, I actually realised I'd forgotten to film any sort of running session. So these shots were gained just before Pete took it away back to Delph Junction. I'll leave a link to Pete's channel in the description below. Please do go and check him out. He's a very nice man, very good friend of mine, and I have serviced 1 or 2 of his locos now. So please do go and check him out. Thanks for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.